Hello, everyone, and I suppose I should say welcome to the second class in public speaking. Um, what the main focus of what we're going to talk about today will be on something called dialogism, and it's sort of a deceptive word. It's this idea we it has something to do with the one of the main difficulties of making a speech being that you are one person, right? And you're talking to many people, right? And as we, mentioned last week, these people cannot talk back to you, right? So it's a one-way conversation, right? And so that's a real limitation of giving a speech. You're unable to. Usually, dialogue allows you to, for example, account for differences in point of view, differences in feeling, and both speakers can take into account these differences to lead to, and it usually enables a richer exchange, and that's really the way that communications works. But of course, in a speech, we have this limitation that a speech isn't really a dialogue, right? So there's actually a theory by a literary critic, a Russian literary critic. His name is Mikhail Bakhtin, and he developed a theory about this sort of capacity to sort of multiply your voice. I'll explain this shortly, but just to this might help you if you look over the general guidelines that are included this week. These are things that I went over in our first week. Notice there's a Thursday group and the Friday group. The Thursday group, it was a little bit of a difficult situation. I think I might want to go over these things again. I don't feel as if some of the main ideas wasn't able to express them as clearly as I would have liked. So we're going to go over these things again the next time we see each other. But if you look at these general guidelines, that is this document that is included this week, you have this. You'll notice the headings are a choice of topic. Have a clear idea of the goal of your speech. Then we have the audience analysis. Then we have this idea of this dialogical approach and delivery and intonation. And when you read these last two parts, dialogical approach and delivery and intonation, an important thing to note is that these two things are linked, right? The idea is that the dialogical approach will really help you with your intonation. And when we say intonation, what do we mean? We mean sort of having, let's say, a significant pause, right? Sometimes you're going to really have a lot of intensity on a fixed word, right? This word, right? There's going to be changes in pitch. You're not always going to have the same pattern. Sometimes you're going to have one pattern in pitch, and another time another, right? And we're going to do exercises on this. We're going to do little punctual exercises on intonation. But what intonation is sort of the melody, is sort of like the musical partition in a sense of what your speech is. So it will include things like dynamics. If you're speaking softly, if you are speaking with a lot of intensity, if you have a high pitch, you have a lower pitch. If you are speaking quickly, your cadence, you might have a passage that you kind of whisk over, or if you slow down, right, which can lead to a sense of gravity. And as what we're going to really kind of study is, we're going to try to have an increased awareness of all of the possibility of the voice, really, right? All of it's amazing to what it's in a sense a shame, insofar as sort of it's very rare that we sort of take advantage of our full expressive capacity, right? So, and this leads me to another parenthesis before we get into this discussion of what dialogism is. There's going to be this idea of full expressive capacity is sort of illustrated in the Barack Obama speech, because that's sort of an example of this kind of, and I would argue that is this dialogical, an illustration of this dialogical approach, and so watch that and we'll discuss that next week. So this idea, dialogism, it's an idea borrowed from literary theory, right? Which kind of makes sense because Mikhail Bakhtin, he wrote about Rabelais, he wrote about Dostoevsky. He was actually a linguist. He was very precise and clever with studying reported speech, direct reported speech, indirect reported speech, free direct discourse. And when we notice reported speech is when one speaker, right, duplicates, right, the words of another speaker, right? So in a sense, with reported speech, we have two speakers. We have the speaker who is speaking directly, and then we have the speaker who has spoken before, but whose words are reported, right? Okay, so it makes sense that this literary critic / linguist, right? Because this Bakhtin, he studied reported speech, that it's not really a surprise that he developed this this dialogical approach to literature. Now, of course, one of the things not only as I said, his first important book was on Rabelais, but he studied the novel. As I said, I mentioned Dostoevsky. One of the great. I don't want to say the great. I'm not going to get into a debate over who the great 19th century Russian novelist is, but at any rate, so he studied the novel, and in the book, I think where this idea is expressed the most clearly, we have it we have it in the French translation, because of course it was written in Russia in the late 20s, or perhaps it was published in the early 30s, and it's Esthétique et théorie du roman. It's édition telle. I'll include the reference. You can look it up. You don't have to read it if you don't want to. It's a really good book of literary criticism. If you like, you learn a lot. So I'll try to sort of put forth his main idea in this book, and hopefully it might give you some ideas about your voice, and it will help you to make sense of this document, this general guidelines document. It should hopefully get us started. Okay, so when Mikhail Bakhtin studies the novel, so he's studying primarily the European novel, 19th century. He's saying that first of all, he makes a distinguish between the voice of a novelist and the voice of a poet. Now, so we'll starting with the voice of a poet. He says poets, and he's sort of repeating sort of the traditional view of a lot of literary critics who say that usually we measure the greatness of a poet by the uniqueness of a poet's voice. If we're talking about Dante or Shakespeare, or if we're talking about Racine, we get these feelings. We get the feeling that these voices are inimitable, right? So these writers have sort of carved out a whole. In a sense, they create a way of speaking, right? And that's sort of the work of the poet. And they speak like no one else, right? So they create this voice that isn't really touched by other voices, right? And usually this is something that in English literary criticism, this idea is in a sense used. This is someone who's writing at the same time, but this sort of traditional idea of the uniqueness of the voice of a great poet. This is sort of expressed by the American literary critic from the beginning, who writes profusively in the early first half of the 20th century. No, he didn't write profusely. He didn't write very much, but he wrote pointedly. He wrote about the fact that, for example, Milton, famous 17th century English poet, the influence of Milton, he said it was sort of too important. And he said that the Romantic poets who were writing 2 centuries later, in the 19th century, and there's sort of 6 great English Romantic poets, there's a sort of almost too many, according to T.S. Eliot, too many great Romantic poets. These Romantic poets, a lot of them, not all of them, I would say of the 4 that it really is true of, are going to be sort of, I would say, Wordsworth mostly, and Shelley. I would say Wordsworth and Shelley, the two that it's the truest of. When they write, right, you can kind of hear Miltonic overtones, right? They haven't any, and so T.S. Eliot claims that they haven't really created any new way of writing, right? They're just sort of borrowing Milton's voice, right? The real work of a poet is to sort of create a unique voice, right? That's sort of if we want to call that the work of the poet, that's the creative act of the poet, not only creating the poems, but creating a unique and distinctive voice that really can't be imitated. Okay. So that is how Bakhtin defines the voice of a poet, and he distinguishes the voice of a poet from the voice of a novel writer. He says in the 19th century, at least, right, which is sort of the heyday of the novel. That's when, the novel as we know it comes into being. For people sometimes say en français que c'est Balzac qui crée le roman moderne, and it's very true that, like, let's say in the 18th century, for example, if we have, let's say, we can have epistolary novels, and they're often sort of historical novels, and we get the feeling that the novel, per se, the novel proper, hasn't really come into being until the 19th century. That's sort of the full-blown novel read by the way, the whole expanding middle class, that is widely published serially. This really sort of explodes, and it's sort of like a Hollywood movie in a sense. This becomes sort of a hugely powerful tool, if you will, communicative tool that's sort of almost mass produced, right? So when we have the heyday of the novel, it's the 19th century. And so Bakhtin says that actually, and also in the 19th century, as you are well aware, that is and notice Bakhtin, he's a Russian writer writing in the early 20th centuries. He's a Marxist critic, and he reminds us that the 19th century is also the century, of the class struggle, where that really, with industry, the second wave of industrialization, the class struggle, and that the class struggle is really present, really in the novel. It's inescapable. So Bakhtin says that the novel, the voice of the novelist, right? And notice he's studying. Notice when you read a novel, right? Of course, you have the voice of the narrator, but then there's also dialogue, right? Okay, and he says, the great novelist, like someone like Dickens, for example. Dickens has a good ear for dialogue, right? The Pickwick Papers. You're going to have Pickwick, the Society. All these characters have their own little unique way of talking. I talked about Balzac. Balzac was, remarkable for his dialogue. He was much far superior than his sort of literary rival Sainte-Beuve, for sort of capturing these voices, like Le Baron de Nucingen, Rastignac, Trompe-la-Mort. These characters, you can hear them, when they, especially from one novel to the next, you have this. So we have this sort of a myriad of distinguished voices, and that are very often not only specific to a given character, but specific to social classes, right? Okay, so according to Bakhtin, he says, unlike the poet, who has sort of a unique voice which is sort of untouchable, right? Because the novel writer, right, or the great novel writers, they actually had sort of a more permeable voice, right? And they not only did they, have direct reported speech with, we have the inverted commas, and we have the dialogue, but their own voice was affected by the voices of others, right? And usually this involved class differences, right? Okay, and this is actually one way to analyze what we call free indirect discours indirect libre, oui. Donc, et là, dans les discours indirects libres, on a beaucoup de mal, et Bakhtin va plus loin dans l'analyse de ce que c'est. Il dit que dans de grands romanciers comme Dostoïevski, il cite Flaubert comme romancier français. Il va dire que à un certain moment, ça va plus loin que tout simplement ce qu'on appelle le discours indirect libre, à savoir qu'on n'arrive plus très souvent à savoir qui parle juste, si c'est la voix du narrateur ou si c'est la voix d'un autre personnage qui est exprimée par la voix du narrateur. Parce qu'il y a une sorte de flottement, un gommage de cette distinction entre la voix rapporteur et la voix rapportée. Donc du coup, so you have this idea that we have this voice, the voice of the novelist kind of opens up and it kind of takes in all these voices. So you can see it's a very important distinction between the lone voice of the novelist, right, and the sort of pluralist, right, inclusive voice of the narrator that kind of that sort of resonates with other voices and takes on their inflections, right? And I would argue that this happens in a lot of the best speeches. So all of the, when we're in our speeches, when we're talking about the dialogical approach, remember very often, I'd like to suggest that that you, first of all, that you really take the audience seriously, and you make sure that if you're speaking about a given topic, someone in the audience might not share your point of view, right? But it's a good idea to voice, right? To voice that opposing point of view that is not your own. And very often when you do that, your voice will kind of incorporate theirs, right? Okay, and it will undergo shifts. I would say significant changes in your own voice, right? And it sounds a little bit magical. It sounds like it's as if you're possessed by something. It might sound a little bit crazy, but it really does happen, and that's a lot of times what irony is. For example, if you say, "Oh, he went over there," and that isn't my voice. I'm sort of imitating someone that's saying something else, right? "Oh, I really want to go to school. Oh yes. That's not me that's talking. In a sense, I'm quoting someone else. And listen to what happened to my voice, right? So that, in a sense, my voice is including another voice. And you can, so in some ways, it can go so far as to be sort of merely imitative, and it's very clear that I'm sort of imitating another voice. But there are shades of imitation. You can sort of take on other imitations when you're sort of adopting, in a sense, for the purposes of openness, right, and to sort of see the merits or disqualify the merits, exploring the merits of other points of view.